from the top where the flame sensor is, or if you look from the bottom, here's the igniter. Usually we'll have 2 wires going to it. On the opposite side of the igniter, if you look across the burners on the other side, is usually where the flame sensor will be. Not all flame sensors are as easy to access as mine, but many of them are pretty accessible. So you can take it out. Make sure you turned off your furnace power switch. I turned off mine previously. And this is your flame sensor. And this gets dirty with time, and once there's enough buildup on it, your furnace will stop sensing the flame. And all you need to clean this flame sensor is a Scotch-Brite pad. You don't want to use sandpaper on it. Dollar bills work very well too, or whatever currency you have in your wallet. So for example, I got a 50. So if you have bigger currency, you definitely want to be careful not to rip it and stuff. But just grab your flame sensor and press hard on it and go ahead and rub it. I don't know why, but apparently currency cleans flame sensors very well. I generally prefer to use Scotch-Brite pads actually. So you shine that thing up and your furnace problem will be resolved. And the Scotch-Brite pads that I'm talking about, they look like this. Pretty much dishwashing scrubbies. You grab it the same way, hold it really tight, and shine it up. But honestly, once in a while I get calls where I forget my tool bag at home. I go out there, and if it's a flame sensor, in a pinch, I've cleaned flame sensors before with just the sleeve of my sweater, and that works just as well. Might not last as long, but it gets the job done. But anyways, I'm not going to get stuck on the flame sensor for too long. I have 2 big videos that dive deeper into this whole flame sensor issue. So if you want to know more about the flame sensor, how it works, and all that stuff, do go ahead and check out those videos. But anyways, this is the #1 offender for furnace calls. And there's some rumors going around that if you clean your flame sensor with a $100 bill, it'll last 100 times longer. I haven't tried that myself, so I don't know, but believe it if you may. Anyways, moving on. #2, with 26 calls out of 315, a dirty furnace filter. And your filter is generally going to be on your return duct. Most people have it L-shaped like I do right here. And your filter will be in the return duct right before the furnace. And just so you know, your filters are directional. Most of them will have an arrow on them right here that says which way the air flows is the way you should put the filter in. Whatever side has a net on it, see how this side doesn't have a net, that wire net, but this side does? That's the side that goes towards the blower fan or towards the furnace. And the reason for that is if for some reason somebody doesn't replace their filter for a long time, it'll get really restricted and the fan will start to suck it in. And I've seen that a couple times where the filter gets completely sucked in and wrapped around the motor shaft. It's really hard to pry it off. That's why one side of the filter has a net on it to prevent it from being sucked in. So if you're like me and you forget to change your filter a lot, what I started doing is just ordering my filters on Amazon. I get a whole box of them. I put the old ones right back into the box. So after I use the filter, you should be changing them really every month or 2. And having a box standing by your furnace kind of reminds you, makes it easier to just swap them out. And one last thing about the filters, I promise this is the last thing. I'm getting stuck on filters for a little too long here. The best filters to buy, the ones we generally recommend, the fiberglass ones that are either blue or green, you know, you can see through them kind of, those tend to let too much through. Then there's these premium filters where the accordion is just closely knit together. They tend to be a little too restrictive, and I have checked air pressure before of all the different filters, and that really is true. So the one we recommend is this medium grade pleated filter where the accordion is a little more spaced out. These tend to catch the most stuff and they're not as restrictive. So I come to a customer's house and the general complaint would be my furnace seems to not be keeping up, or I can see the burners come on for a couple minutes and turn off, or maybe, you know, when it's colder outside my furnace isn't keeping up, and generally that'll be because it's overheating. And the furnace, if you look right here, has a high limit, which generally will look like this. Sometimes it'll be a smaller switch, but usually it's a big rectangle looking thing like that with 2 wires going to it. That's a high limit. And basically if the furnace inside is getting too hot because there's not enough air going through it, then that high limit trips and it turns the burners off, leaves the fan on, cools itself off, and then turns back on and repeats that cycle over and over. And some furnaces have a lockout feature. If it overheats 3 to 5 times in one heating cycle, it'll go into a lockout for 3 hours, where it'll just sit there and do nothing. And then it'll restart and try again. Alright, moving on to number 3. Number 3 was a bad inducer motor. So out of 315 calls, 24 were a bad inducer motor. And what that will look like, many times the furnace isn't working at all. You come down, you take off the furnace door, and if you put your hand on the inducer motor, a lot of times it'll be scorching hot. You'll like burn your hand, you have to let go right away. Or there are times when it's not hot. In those cases, you want to check with your meter and see if it's actually getting 120 volts from the control board, because sometimes it's actually the board that's bad and not the inducer motor, where it's just not sending power to it. But long story short, if the inducer motor is getting 120 volts but it's not turning on, the inducer motor is bad. The only other scenario is if your motor has something stuck in it, like a bird or a mouse or a bat or some bird nest or something like that. And an easy way to check that is sometimes you'll have a cooling fan in front of your inducer motor, or you have, like in my case, I do see my fan. It's going to be hard to see on the camera, but there's a fan behind these grates. You can try to stick like a little screwdriver in there and spin it and see if it spins. If it's spinning freely, or rather freely I should say, that means you probably don't have anything in there or anything stuck in there, and your inducer motor is just bad. And of course the easy fix for that is to just replace the whole inducer motor. Usually they come as a little assembly, which makes them pretty easy to replace. Moving on to 4th place. And 4th place was a bad blower motor with 23 calls. And the blower motor is down here on an upflow furnace. The blower motor is usually on the bottom section of the furnace, and that's this thing right here. This is the blower motor housing. And if you reach in, there's the blower motor. There's the capacitor right below it right here. Every blower motor will have a capacitor. That's that thing right there. And if you reach in on the other side, generally you can put your hand in there and spin the blower wheel or the squirrel cage by hand. Now, if the blower motor is bad or seizing up, you won't be able to freely spin that fan. You'll feel that it's seized up or it's hard to spin. Another indicator is if you reach in there and touch that motor, it'll be really hot most of the time. And why those fail is A, because your filter was dirty for a long time. Maybe there was just some kind of electrical surge. Many times the capacitor is dead. That little capacitor that I pointed to earlier, that kind of gives the fan a boost to get it spinning. If that thing's completely dead, your fan will have a really hard time turning on. So generally I'll come to a house and the customer will tell me either the fan starts very sluggishly and then completely quits, or they say they're smelling some kind of a burnt electrical smell in the house. Then almost guaranteed that that blower motor is bad. Sometimes the whole wheel will be messed up too, where it'll be just scraping the sides of that housing. And of course the remedy for that is to replace the blower motor. If the wheel is bad, replace the wheel, and you always replace the capacitor as well. And if that's the problem you're experiencing at your house, I do have a video where I replaced my motor and I filmed the whole thing. So if you need help with replacing your blower motor, do check that video out. And coming in 5th place is a bad control board. And the control board is generally going to be right in front of the blower housing. My control board is right here. They look differently on various furnaces. Older furnaces will not have control boards. They'll just have a few relays. But most furnaces will have a board that looks similar to this. And once in a while they will be up in the top section, but generally they're here. And what happens is, customer will call us and tell us, hey, either my furnace is not working at all, or it's doing something weird, like the fan will not turn off no matter what I do. I would have to turn the whole furnace switch off just to turn the blower fan off, just constantly running. Sometimes it'll do something weird, like turn on the AC as it's running the furnace, or it's simply not sending power to something. And a lot of times when you take the board off and look on the other side of it, you'll see some burn marks on it. And of course, that's a dead giveaway that the board is bad. And I also have a video on how to troubleshoot a control board as well. So if you think your problem is the control board, you can go ahead and check that video out. And that way we won't have to spend any more time on the control board. And coming in 6th place with 15 calls each, we have a two-way tie. The first one is a bad gas valve. The gas valve is right here. Generally, it will be in the upper section of the furnace, above the burners. Sometimes it'll be below. But basically, if your gas valve is getting power, yet it's not opening, then that just means that the solenoid on the gas valve is bad. And generally, you can't just replace the coil on it. You have to replace the whole gas valve. And what that would look like is the furnace will start up normally, where your inducer motor will start, your pressure switches will close, you'll see your igniter glowing, and that's it. Nothing else happens. It just glows and then shuts off. And I have seen times before where customers will accidentally turn off the gas to the furnace and they thought they were turning it off to something else, like a water heater or maybe a garage heater. They turn it off and that will give you similar results where, you know, the igniter will glow. But in that instance, you actually hear the gas valve opening. It'll be like a click, click, but no gas comes out. In that case, your furnace is simply just not getting gas. So if you're experiencing that problem, then yes, you just need to replace the whole gas valve. And the other one in sixth place is a bad heat exchanger. Now, when I say bad heat exchanger, I'm talking about both the primary heat exchanger, which is behind all of this, or behind the wall of the furnace here. That's the main component of the furnace. And high efficiency furnaces, an easy way to tell if you have a high efficiency furnace is if you have PVC venting. So if you have plastic pipes coming out of your furnace instead of a steel one like mine, that means you have a high efficiency furnace. Mine is not high efficiency, it's just an 80% furnace. So it has just one heat exchanger, the primary heat exchanger. And those high efficiencies, they have two. They have the primary and the secondary, which creates water or condensation. So what is a heat exchanger and why is it so important? The heat exchanger is the main component of the furnace, and that is basically the thing that separates your house air from the combustion fumes that are going out your chimney. Usually it's a tubular looking thing. It kind of snakes back and forth. They do it that way so that the heat stays in there longer, so it's not just going straight up and out. That way you're losing a lot of efficiency. Or sometimes it'll be split up into cells, and those cells or tubes, with time they will crack. And although they are designed to last as long as the average life of the furnace, which is about 15 years, there are circumstances that can kill them a lot faster. So for example, that dirty filter that we talked about earlier, if your furnace is constantly overheating, that will kill your heat exchanger a lot faster. Or a plugged A coil, or bad ductwork, or maybe your furnace was installed poorly to begin with. That can all decrease the lifetime of a furnace. I've condemned furnaces before that were only 6 or 8 years old. So what this would look like, a lot of times the customer will call us because the furnace is simply not working, or something's not right, or something smells outside by the exhaust fumes differently. A lot of times I'll come and I'll see that the flame rollout switches, which in my case are right here. In different furnaces they're in different spots, but these flame rollouts are manual reset switches. They have a little button on them. If your flame rollout switch is tripped, that means that your burner chamber right here was getting too hot, or sometimes the flames literally roll out backwards and you can see them just coming back out, and that's what these switches are here for. If it's getting too hot, they will trip. And one way we can tell if the heat exchanger is bad or not is by putting a combustion analyzer probe into the chimney or into your exhaust pipe and seeing how much carbon monoxide is going out your chimney. It should be generally under 100 parts per million on a normally operating furnace. Generally, if you have a bad furnace or a bad heat exchanger, your carbon monoxide parts per million will go through the roof. They'll be like 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, and then you want to pull out your probe right away, otherwise it'll peg your meter. If the carbon monoxide going out the chimney is that high, then generally you are having a problem with your heat exchanger. And then if we want to visually verify if it's bad or not, sometimes you can pull the blower motor out. If you have an 80% furnace, you can pull the whole thing out, get under there and look at it from the bottom where you see the whole heat exchanger and try to find a crack or to see where it's cracked that way. Or you can take out that high limit, and if you have an inspection camera or an endoscope for your phone, you can also snake in there and try to see where the cracks are. Long story short, the American Gas Association states that by code, if there is a crack or a hole in your heat exchanger, the heat exchanger or the whole furnace must be replaced. And the reason that's so important is because the heat exchanger is the thing that keeps all the combustion fumes out of your house supply air. So if that thing has a crack or a hole in it and it's producing that much carbon monoxide, and somehow that carbon monoxide leaks out into your air supply, especially at night when everybody's sleeping, it will only take minutes to kill everybody in the house, including the dog. But anyway, enough about the heat exchanger. Moving on, in 7th place, we also have a two-way tie with 11 calls each. The first one is a bad igniter. Your igniter is right here. In mine, it's on the right side. Usually it'll have a plug like this, a little Molex plug that you can unplug. What that would look like is the customer says the furnace turns on, it seems to start working, but it never actually lights. So I come down to the basement, I turn the furnace switch off, turn it back on, and I see what it does. So you'll see the inducer motor come on. After a while, generally you will hear the gas valve open and a little bit of gas will come out, but the igniter was never glowing. Most of the time, that means your igniter is bad. And if you want to check it with the meter, you can put your leads into the plug in the metal parts. One lead in here and one lead in here. If the igniter is getting 120 volts, but it's not glowing, then you know you have a bad igniter. Or you can turn the power off to your furnace, unplug your igniter, and then set your meter to resistance and put both leads into both plugs. And if you have OL, that means the igniter is bad as well. And once you replace it, your furnace should fire right back up. And the other one in 7th place with 11 calls is a plugged A coil. So it'll be a similar scenario where the furnace is overheating and tripping on that high limit. And the A coil, or the evaporator coil, is part of the air conditioner. And if you have an upflow furnace, generally it'll be sitting on top of your furnace, and you'll see these refrigerant pipes coming to it, along with the drain line on the bottom here. And this coil, it looks like a radiator, almost like the unit you have standing outside, your air conditioner. You know how it gets plugged up with time as it's sucking air on the sides? So same thing happens with that one. After a while, especially if you're not very good at changing your furnace filters, or if you have a filter that lets a lot through, after a while, all the dust and debris that gets past the filter will settle on the underside of that A coil and plug it up, causing a restriction in the airflow. So a lot of heat starts to build up in here because it can't get out. And that, of course, will trip your high limit once it gets too hot. The company I work for, we don't do A coil cleaning unless they're very easy to access. A lot of them aren't very easily accessible. So we just recommend that people hire some duct cleaners to come out and clean that underside of their A coil. But it is possible to clean it yourself. Just search on YouTube how to clean your evaporator coil or A coil, and I'm sure you'll find some videos of people cleaning their A coils, and you'll see what that entails. And moving on, in 8th place with 9 calls, we have a bad ignition module. And a bad ignition module is basically a control board, but the difference between a control board like this and an ignition module or ignition control is that the ignition module is only for the ignition. So it only controls the gas valve, the spark, if you have a spark igniter, and the flame sensor. Whereas this control board, it controls both the gas part and the fan, which is why sometimes it's called the IFC, which stands for Integrated Furnace Control. But anyways, that ignition module, a lot of times I'll come out and what it'll be doing is, if it's a spark igniter, for some reason it won't be sending the spark to the igniter, or maybe it's not sending power to the gas valve. And of course, to check that, you would have to test it with your meter. I don't have an ignition module on my furnace, so I can't show you. But basically, you would just check with your meter to see if it's sending power to the gas valve or if it's sending power to the spark. And if it's not, then the ignition module is bad and needs to be replaced. And in 9th place, we have a 2-way tie with 8 orders each. The first one is a bad thermostat. And a lot of times what that will look like is on the thermostat, you turn on your heat or your furnace or even your fan, and nothing happens, or maybe just one of them's not working. Yet if you take the thermostat off the wall and jumper R to W, which is basically jumpering the heat call, then the furnace turns on and everything works good. In that case, you know that just the thermostat is bad and nothing's wrong with the furnace itself. And in my furnace playlist, I have 2 videos of how to bypass the thermostat, just for that reason, to see if it's bad or not. I have a video of how to bypass the thermostat at the thermostat itself, and then I have a video of how to bypass the thermostat at the control board. So if you think your thermostat is bad, you can check out those videos and go from there. And the other one in 9th place is a dirty pilot assembly. And of course, I don't have this on my furnace because mine is a hot surface igniter. But what that is an intermittent pilot system. It'll have a little pilot hood, a spark igniter generally, and a flame sensor. So what happens is it'll have a silver tube coming out of the gas valve, which is the pilot tube. That pilot tube opens up first, lets out gas into the pilot to light that pilot intermittently, or basically when there's a call for heat. So that little pilot lights, and once the flame sensor proves that there's a little flame there, then that will tell the gas valve to open up and light all the burners. And what happens is that little pilot tube that goes to the pilot hood, there's a little orifice in there, which is really tiny. That little orifice, if there's some gunk that falls on it, maybe some scaling or some rust or dust or any kind of debris, that little hole is very small. if some stuff falls on that little pilot orifice, that will plug it up and your pilot flame will not be hitting that flame sensor as well as it should be. Or maybe your pilot will be really lazy looking. The pilot usually is basically two sharp flames. If you see your pilot just going straight up, that means something's going on, and most likely that pilot orifice is dirty. So all you got to do is take that whole thing out. Sometimes you can get away with just taking it out from the bottom and then being careful in how you bend that tube so you don't kink it. Just get it out far enough where you can take apart that pilot assembly to get to that orifice. Other times you have to take off the nut here and here, just take the whole thing out. Get to the orifice and clean it out. I generally use just a little piece of my brass brush, just one hair, to get into that little orifice and clean it up. And then you put everything back together and everything works once again. And last but not least, in 10th place, coming in with 7 calls, we have a plugged condensate trap. And a lot of times that will be a carrier with that white trap, but there are other ones that get plugged up as well. So if you have a carrier or a Bryant furnace and you see a white trap on it, in those cases your furnace will be blinking a pressure code error. If you take off the thick hose from that trap, if that's the problem you're having, generally there will be a ton of water that comes out of that hose. So if you take that hose off and a lot of water comes rushing out, that means your trap is probably plugged up. So unhook all the hoses, the one from the bottom as well, take that trap out, and then flush it with hot water and close all the holes and just shake it vigorously. Flush it out, fill it up again, shake it vigorously until you can pour water into each of the holes on top, the 3 holes, and see water coming out the other end. But once you clean that condensate trap up real good, that will take care of your pressure switch problem, which is caused by that plugged up condensate trap, which is causing water to back up in your collector box, and your pressure switch hose generally hooks up right to that collector box. So if it senses that there's water in there, it will shut the furnace off. And unfortunately, all good things come to an end. That was all for my top 10 furnace problems, but that was only about a third of all the stuff that I wrote down. So let's not let all my efforts go to waste and go through the rest of the list as honorable mentions. Coming in with 6 calls is a high limit that's stuck open. And what that would look like is I'll come to somebody's house and their blower fan is just constantly on and nothing else works. A lot of times the control board will be blinking an error code as well that will say circuit lockout or limit lockout. And what happens sometimes is if you have a dirty filter for a while and your limit keeps tripping over and over and over again, that limit switch, it's made out of 2 different metals, and when they heat up, one of them warps and disconnects, which interrupts the circuit. And if that keeps happening over and over and over again, sometimes that switch will get stuck open. And what you can do, which almost works every time, is take a screwdriver or a nut driver and just give your high limit switch just a good few knocks. And a lot of times that will be enough to free it up. If that doesn't free it up, you can try to take the screws out, take the limit out, and just knock it against the cabinet or the floor, and that should free it up. If nothing frees it up, well, then you just have to replace the limit. And if you want to check your limit with a voltmeter as your furnace is running, you can put both leads on both terminals on the limit, and you should have 0 volts if the switch is closed. If you have 27 volts, that means the switch is open. And coming in with 5 calls, we have a bad pressure switch. I have 2 of them in mind, and sometimes, once again, similar to the high limit, the pressure switches can get stuck in either a closed or open position. And if it's stuck in any of those positions, your furnace will not work. Unfortunately, taking these things off and hitting them will not do you any good. You could try to take the little pressure switch hose off and gently blow through it or suck on it to try to exercise that diaphragm. And if it's stuck, sometimes it'll free it up. And if that works for you, great. If not, well, then you just have to replace that pressure switch. I had 3 calls of a damaged or noisy blower wheel. And those calls, the blower motor would still be working, but it'll just be making a lot of racket. Either the blower wheel was out of balance, or some of the fins were broken off, so it was just scraping against the sides of it, just making a lot of noise. In that case, I usually replace the blower motor and the wheel and the capacitor, just the whole set to get it done with. I had 1 call where I had a bad 3-wire pilot. Some older furnaces have those where instead of a flame sensor, it'll just be like a big bar. Not a lot of them out there left. But on a 3-wire pilot, it's not a flame sensor that you can clean. So if it's not sensing the flame for some reason, then you just have to replace that whole assembly. I had 2 blown 3-amp fuses, which is generally going to be on your control board somewhere. Or in my case, It's just on these 2 wires in series with the secondary side of the transformer. And as far as I can remember, one of those was a bare thermostat wire. I think it was either the R or the W, and it was touching the door of the furnace, and that was shorting it out. And for the other one, I remember replacing the fuse, and I couldn't find anything wrong. So I just ran the furnace for like 20 minutes, and it was working great. I called it a day, told the guy to call me if anything else comes up. But anyways, if your 3 amp fuse is popping while you're running your furnace, the first thing you want to do is look for any bare 24 volt wires, or basically the thermostat wires. I also had one call where the furnace breaker was tripped and I couldn't figure out why. Once again, I reset the breaker, I checked everything, all the amp draws, there's no bare wires, found nothing wrong. Once again, ran the furnace for like 20 minutes and everything was working great. So I was thinking maybe something was wrong with the breaker itself, because the furnace, I wasn't finding anything. But anyways, reset that breaker and it's been working. I never got called back to that one. And coming in with 3 calls, I had a leaking collector box. My furnace doesn't even have a collector box. Only high efficiency furnaces will have a collector box. Once again, the high efficiency furnace is the one with the PVC venting, the 2 plastic pipes coming out. Generally 2, sometimes it'll be just 1. But on high efficiency furnaces, behind your inducer motor, there's also going to be a collector box. So if water for some reason is backing up in your condensate line, the water that's backing up will go into that collector box until it trips a pressure switch. Because the pressure switch is connected to the collector box, so if the water level gets up to the level where the pressure switch hose connects, that will shut off your furnace. But anyways, I had 3 of those boxes that were leaking, and there's not much you could do for that. You could try to silicone it. That doesn't work too well. The recommended fix for that is to just replace that collector box. I had 4 calls where the customer told me, hey, my furnace is not working at all. I come out to that house and all it is just dead thermostat batteries. So I replaced the batteries and everything fires right back up. I had 1 gas valve that was leaking through, which means that for some reason when the heat call would be over, the gas valve wouldn't close all the way and there would be some gas still coming through. And there's really nothing you could do for that except just replace the whole gas valve. I had 1 call that was a burnt rodent smell. So a customer called us because he was smelling a burnt rodent smell that he thought was coming from the furnace. So I came out, I checked everything out, checked my carbon monoxide readings in the flue, checked my amp draws, my motors, checked the ductwork all around, the filter, found nothing wrong. I told the guy, hey, your furnace is working great. This smell is not coming from the furnace or the ductwork. And I just so happened to come back to that house for a dryer, maybe like 4 months later, and I asked him, hey, is your furnace still smelling like a rodent? And he told me, no, actually, you know what? Like a month after you left, I actually happened to come down to my basement, and I was lucky that I came down there at that time. I saw my electrical outlet in that room starting to smolder and melt and smoke. Luckily he was there when that was happening, so he was able to just shut off his breaker to that room, get an electrician out there and get that whole outlet replaced. But that was kind of interesting that the burnt rodent smell was actually coming from his electrical outlet frying itself. I had 1 call where too many vents were closed off, so the customer had just 2 floors and he had more vents on his basement floor than he did in his upper floor, and he closed them all off, and that was just too much vents closed off and his furnace started to overheat. So I told him to open all of them back up, and his supply temperature coming out the furnace dropped drastically after he opened up all the vents. I had 2 calls where the customer would call and say, hey, my furnace is leaking up a storm. There's a big puddle underneath it. I would come out and the furnace is not leaking at all. In fact, some of those furnaces are 80% furnaces, which don't even create water. So if you're running your furnace, there should be no water. So whenever I get a furnace call that involves the furnace leaking water, I always look around the furnace. Like for example, I have a water heater right next to mine. I have a humidifier. And those 2 calls that I had, both of them were the humidifier that was leaking. What happened is they didn't replace their water panel filter inside their humidifier for a long time. And eventually that water panel just gets really brittle and soggy. And it just kind of flops down. And if water is pouring out, if you have your humidifier on, it just runs down your return duct and just starts to pool up, and eventually you're going to have water all over the floor around your furnace. I had 1 call where the burners, the in-shop burners, were so dirty that the carbon monoxide readings I was getting were like over 400 parts per million, and all I had to do is take all those in-shop burners out. There was like a lot of rust and buildup on it. Just brush them all out real good. I blew them out with some compressed air, put them back in, and that dropped it to, if my memory doesn't fail me, I think it was like 45, which is a pretty big change from 400. I had 4 calls where there was a weak blower motor capacitor. The customer would say whenever my blower motor starts it starts off very sluggishly. So I checked the capacitor with my meter, and sure enough, the capacitor is almost dead. So I replaced the capacitor and everything's good to go. But if the capacitor is really weak or almost near dead, then you're better off just replacing the motor as well. But if you want a temporary fix, then replacing that capacitor should do the trick. I had one call where the thermostat wire inside the thermostat was bad. And what that looked like is, nothing was working. I took the thermostat off the wall. All the wires are connected right. But when I gently tugged on each wire, the W wire just kind of snapped right off. So that little copper part that goes under the screw, that was just broken right off. And that was interrupting the call for heat. So all I had to do is snip that part off, strip off another piece of wire, put it back in there, and everything fired right back up. I had 4 calls where the customer thought that his furnace wasn't working, but it actually was a programmable thermostat that they didn't know how to use. So they would set a temperature on their thermostat, but the program, like every couple hours, it'll revert back to the programming. And the customer didn't know that there's a hold button, and if you press it, it overrides the program. And they weren't aware that there's a program in the background. So they would be constantly battling their thermostat and then thinking that their furnace isn't keeping up because the thermostat would automatically revert back to the programming that's in the background. So those calls become a little educational session. I teach them how the programming works, and most importantly, I teach them about the hold button. So you set the temperature to whatever you want, you press hold, and that will override any programming that's in the background. And most people like that hold option the most. I had 2 calls where the transformer was bad, and generally what will be bad is the secondary side. Transformers, they have 2 sides. They have the primary side, which is the 120 volt side, and then you got the secondary side, which is your 24 volt side. Most of the time it's that 24 volt side that goes bad. So if you disconnect both wires from it and just take a resistance reading or an ohm reading of that secondary side, if you see OL, that means that secondary side of the transformer is bad and it needs to be replaced. Another easy way to check it is if you have 120 volts going to the primary side of the transformer, you should be getting 24 volts on the other side as well. So if you set your meter to voltage and put your meter leads on the secondary side, you should have 24 volts if your primary side has 120 volts. If you don't have 24 volts, that means your transformer is bad and should be replaced. I had 2 calls where the fan relay was bad, and this is mostly just on older furnaces where instead of a control board, it'll have a fan relay. And those tend to get either stuck open or stuck closed, and it won't turn on the fan, or on the contrary, it'll always run the fan non-stop. So you just replace that fan relay and your problem goes away. I had 1 call where the motor bracket was loose, so whenever the blower motor would come on, it would come on with a really loud bang, just boom, and then it would start. And the reason that was happening is the motor bracket that holds that motor, it was loosely on there, so whenever the motor would start, the torque from the motor would crank the motor and it would just hit against the bracket, and that's what would make that loud racket every time it started. So I took that bracket off, I threw it away, and I put on the MB55 motor bracket, and it worked like a champ, no more noise. I only had 1 furnace call where the power switch was just simply off. I don't know what happened, maybe some kids were playing and bumped it off, or somebody was replacing a furnace filter and bumped it off. But all I had to do was turn that furnace power switch back on, and everything fired right back up. I had 3 calls for a noisy furnace, and one of those was the sheet metal piece that's on the bottom of the furnace. Somehow that had come undone, and it was just making a trrrr noise every time the blower motor was working because of the suction. So only one side was undone, so it would just sit there and kind of hit against the cabinet of the furnace, making a rattling noise. So all I had to do was just secure that metal panel to the cabinet of the furnace with a screw, and the noise went away. I had another one where the blower motor for some reason was noisy, and I could not figure out why. But every time I would stick my hand in and push the blower motor housing up, the noise would go away. So because I couldn't really figure out why it's doing that, I just took a 2x4 and just jammed it underneath the blower motor, and that solved the problem. And the last noise call I had was regarding the ductwork. So everything was working great, but it was rattling up a storm throughout the ductwork. And I found the spot, the culprit, and somehow the slip joint, or the drive I should say, got undone. And it was just rattling up a storm. So all I had to do was just push that thing back together and the noise went away. I had 2 thermostat calls where the thermostat was wired wrong, and usually that happens because the customer replaces the thermostat and they forgot to look at the wiring and how it's wired before they took the old wires off. So they put the new one back on and the labels are a little different and they're not sure where everything goes. So they do it to the best of their memory, and a day or 2 later, I come out to fix it. I had 1 call where the gas valve was set to pilot. This was on a really old furnace. The gas valve had 3 positions, the on, off, and pilot. It was actually a standing pilot, And I guess during the summer, the customer had turned his gas valve to pilot and forgot about it. So all I had to do was just come out there and turn the knob to the on position, and it fired right up and everything worked great. I had one call where I had a bad spark module. It's just a little black box where your spark igniter hooks up to, and that little black box is the one that sends the spark. So the box is bad, therefore no spark, and nothing happens. So I replaced the spark module and it fired right back up. I had one call where the flame rollout switch was tripped, so I reset it. I checked everything and I couldn't find why that thing had tripped. So I double checked everything again and once again found nothing wrong. So that one was kind of interesting. I had 3 calls where the gas pressure was set too high on the gas valve, and that was either set too high or not adjusted when the furnace was installed originally, or maybe another service tech came out previously and set the gas pressure too high. Or if you don't have a regulator on your gas piping, it could even be from the gas company. If their gas pressures were going up and down, that could affect your gas valve as well and just throw off its pressures. So all I had to do on those calls is just adjust the gas pressure. It should be between 3.2 and 3.8 inches of water column. I usually set it at about 3.4. I had 3 calls where there was a spider web inside of the gas valve orifice, and those particular calls are in mobile home furnaces or in the trailer park furnaces, generally Coleman's. It'll be just one gas valve with an orifice inside of it with one big burner. And that orifice, if you screw it apart, during the summer it seems like spiders just love to make a web in there. Just a complete web that covers up the whole gas valve orifice. So if you take a wrench and take that orifice out, you'll see a bunch of stuff in there. Just clear it all out, put that orifice back on, put it all back together, and the furnace fires right back up. I also had one call where the orifice on the gas manifold was plugged up, also from a spider. There's 4 of them. Generally on furnaces like this, you'll have 4 orifices, sometimes 5 or 6 depending on how many burners you have. But if you take an inspection mirror and just stick it in there and look at every single orifice, what was happening is all my burners would light, but my 3rd burner would not come on. So I stuck an inspection mirror in there and I saw that the orifice was just covered with white stuff, which turned out to be a spider web. So in that case, all I had to do was just take a little piece of wire, I bent it and just pulled it in there and just cleared that orifice out. That way I didn't have to take out this whole manifold to clean it. I tested it and it fired right back up. I had one call where a carrier inducer motor, there was a few model of carriers where for some reason their pressure switch ports on the carrier inducer motor assembly was too small, and per the manufacturer you actually had to drill out that pressure switch port, otherwise your furnace would always have pressure switch problems, which was exactly what was happening to me. They kept having a pressure switch problem, and after I drilled out that port and put the hose back on, that problem went away. I had 3 calls where the condensate trap was leaking. Generally, it'll be those carrier traps. Sometimes it'll be the Lennox traps, where it'll be a black trap either inside or on the side of the furnace. And once again, of course, this only applies to high-efficiency furnaces, and the fix for that is just replacing that trap. I had one call where the actual power switch on the side of the furnace was bad, and once that switch got replaced, everything fired right back up. I had 3 calls where the furnace blower speed was set too low for that size of a furnace, so all I had to do was just increase the fan speed and everything went back to normal. I had 3 calls where the condensate line was leaking, once again on high efficiency furnaces. I believe 2 of them were PVC piping, where I guess somebody stepped on them and it cracked. And the fix for that is pretty simple. Just replace that whole condensate drain line. If it's very long, then just replace that piece that is leaking. I went on one call where the customer said his furnace was not working, not doing anything, and all it was is his thermostat was just simply turned off. So they would adjust the temperature, but nothing was happening, nothing was turning on. So all I had to do on that call is literally just turn it to heat, and everything fired right back up. I had one call where I had to relight a standing pilot. I guess a downdraft must have put it out or something. I relit it, the thermocouple was good, the pilot flame looked nice, everything worked great. I replaced 3 inducer control boards, and not very many furnaces have it. I think it's mainly Carrier, the older model of Carriers that have them, where the inducer motor will have its own little control board, and those tend to go bad. So I replaced 3 of those. I had 3 bird nests in the intake. This mostly applies to the high efficiency furnaces with the PVC vent and intake. For some reason, birds just love making nests inside of those intake pipes. So I just cleared out those nests and the furnace fired right back up. And finally, the last one. I'm starting to lose my voice here. But the last one, I only had one call, and that one was the door switch was not being pushed in all the way by the furnace door. And of course, the door switch is almost like a secondary power switch. So if for some reason that's not pushed in, that'll interrupt power to your whole furnace. So I guess the customer had taken off the bottom door, and when he put it back on, he didn't put it on correctly, so it wasn't pushing the door switch in all the way. So all I had to do is put the door back on correctly, so the door switch closes all the way, and the furnace fired right back up. Well guys, and that is it for my list of furnace problems. I hope you found this video useful. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you're not subscribed to this channel yet, don't be a stranger and subscribe. And as always, don't forget to mash that like button on the way out, and we'll see you next time.